Notes before we begin. The first note is that this event will be recorded. So please take a moment to turn off your camera if you don't want to be visible in that recording. It's going to be posted on the Suda for Solidarity YouTube channel, so you know kind of where that's going. My second note is that we have captions available for this event. If you'd like to enable them on your Zoom, you can go ahead to the bottom of your screen where your toolbar will show up if you hover over it and hit the show subtitle option, which should be available under the More button. And if you need any help with that, feel free to ask for it in the chat and we can get someone to assist you. The event tonight has been organized by Suda for Solidarity's Education and Advocacy Committees. So tremendous thanks to all of our volunteers who've made our time tonight possible. We could not do it without you. And before I introduce our guest tonight, I wanted to offer a few invitations to everyone who's in attendance. The first is during Kazu Haga's presentation, if you could go ahead and remain muted, that would be really excellent. And feel free to unmute to ask questions in the Q&A that will follow. And as we are here together tonight, I'd like to invite you to be present, but also to take breaks as needed. If you need to turn off your camera at any point, that's completely fine. And to share good energy and ask questions at any time in the chat as the presentation goes on. And so, without further ado, I'd like to go ahead and introduce our speaker. Kazu Haga will be giving us a presentation and then a robust Q&A will follow, and you'll have opportunities to follow up on anything that Kazu Haga talks about or any questions that come up that you would like to ask him. So Kazu Haga is our guest tonight, and he's the founder and coordinator of the East Point Peace Academy, and author of the book, Healing Resistance, A Radically Different Response to Harm. He's an experienced trainer certified in several methodologies of nonviolence and restorative justice, having received training from elders including Dr. Bernard Lafayette, Reverend James Lawson, and Joanna Macy. He teaches nonviolence, conflict reconciliation, restorative justice, organizing, and mindfulness in prisons and jails, high schools and youth groups, and with activist communities around the country. He has over 20 years of experience in nonviolence and social change work and has been an active trainer since the year 2000. Kazu is also an avid meditator and enjoys being in nature, and he's a diehard fan of the Boston Celtics and of mixed martial arts, the latter of which he is still sometimes conflicted about. And he resides in Oakland, California. So thank you so much, Kazu, for being here with us, and I'll go ahead and turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. どうもありがとうございます。皆さん、こんにちは or こんばんは, depending on where you are calling in from. Really cool to be here with you all. I love Tsuru, and as a Japanese person, I was born in Japan. I spent the first 7 years there, still have a Japanese passport. Yeah, as a Japanese person, to see a gathering of Japanese and Nikkei folks doing justice work is really inspiring to me. So thank you for being here tonight, but also for being out there in the world, doing the work that you're doing. Good to see a couple of names that I recognize. I thought I saw Auntie June's name in there pop up. So, hey, I haven't seen you in so long. Yeah, so where to start? I want to share a few stories and then leave plenty of time for discussion at the end, because I really want to be in dialogue with everybody. And yeah, just being in dialogue is where I also get to learn and grow. So we'll make sure to leave plenty of time for that. And also, I'm aware that this is a group that's probably mixed with some folks who have read the book and some folks who have not. So I'll probably share just a couple of stories from the book that I think are pretty central. So if you've read the book, just bear with us. And also, I know there's at least one person here who was at the workshop that I was facilitating this past weekend. So some similar stories. But bear with us, and I promise there'll be some new stuff as well. And, I oftentimes say that when the world's greatest boxer, whoever you think that might be at the moment, goes into the gym, they still practice how to throw the jab, right? Because you can never get enough fundamentals. And so hopefully, even if you've heard these stories, you'll get something new out of it. But I'll just start very briefly with an intro and just a very kind of quick arc of how I ended up here. Many of you know the story, but I got my start in activism. In some ways, the seeds were planted by my mom, who was always a very kind and spiritual person, if not a political person. And but we had a lot of struggles in our family growing up. And when I was 15 years old, I dropped out of high school. And when I was 17 years old, I took part in a project called the Interfaith Pilgrimage of the Middle Passage, which was a walking pilgrimage initiated by a Japanese Buddhist order called Nipponzan Myohoji. And they were going to walk from Massachusetts down the coast to New Orleans to retrace the slave route and to talk about the legacy that slavery left behind in this country. And I was just this, 17-year-old high school dropout with nothing going in my life. And I heard about it. I thought it was interesting. I told my mom I'd check it out for a week, and I left home for a year and a half. Ended up on this journey with these monastics for 6 months, and then spending a year overseas living in their monasteries. And so my introduction to all of this work was always at that intersection of spiritual practice and political activism. And when I came home from that experience, I jumped right into social change work and became a nonviolence trainer and was doing mass trainings, preparing people for demonstrations and civil disobedience and the like. And it was weird having just come back from monastery, and particularly a monastery whose lineage is so directly connected to peace work and social change work, to be thrown into social change movements of the late 1990s, where any of you who were around then might remember, the intersection of political activism and spirituality was not something that was being talked about. Like, if you were in political activist spaces, there was no talk about spirituality, no talk about healing, no talk about trauma. It was a very heady space. And it was very like anti-spirituality in a lot of ways. And so it felt like there was these two parts of my life that were always disconnected. And 10 years into that life, I took this 2-day workshop called Kingian Nonviolence Conflict Reconciliation, which is a philosophy developed out of the teachings of Dr. King. And those 2 days just completely changed my life forever. And in so many ways, this philosophy became the thing that helped to bridge all of the different sides of who I was. The spiritual aspect, the political aspect. And so I've been doing that work for about 10 years. It's what I wrote the book on. Healing Resistance is largely about the Kingian nonviolence curriculum. But I've also, grown a lot since then. I've been doing it for a little over 10 years. And a lot of the work that I do now is in addition to the connection between spiritual practice and political activism, also bringing in a lot of trauma healing components. And so maybe we'll get to talk about that a little bit towards the end as well. But I want to start by sharing some of the key concepts that I learned in that weekend when I took that first Kingian nonviolence workshop. And so let me see here. I believe you all can see the screen now, right? Cool. So you've all seen things like this before. I welcome you into the chat box. And as soon as you notice the difference between these two images, you can just enter it into the chat box. What do you see are different between the image on the left and the image on the right? And as soon as you see it, go ahead and enter it into the chat. Yeah, one has a different color fencing, the butterfly, arrow, the other bird in the sky. So most of you probably got these. There's another flower, the butterfly. There's one more. The next one's a little bit more complicated. There's a few more differences. What is the difference between these two images? The apple. Yep, there's an extra apple, the color of the apple, the reflection on the window, the flowers on the ground, the pig's smile. Yep, so I don't know if you were able to catch all of them this time, but there are all of these differences. I'm going to do one more. What is the difference between these two? Some of you have read the book, so it's a little giveaway, but it's the hyphen, right? some people write nonviolence with a hyphen, and some people write nonviolence without the hyphen. And most people believe that they're interchangeable, that the hyphen doesn't actually change anything about the meaning of the word. But from a Kingian perspective, the hyphen changes everything. Because when you put the hyphen in the word, what it does is it separates the word, right? Non-hyphen violence just means not violent. Something is the absence of violence. And I always say that that is the most dangerous and most common misunderstanding of the idea of nonviolence. That nonviolence simply means as long as I'm not being violent, then I'm practicing nonviolence. And I want to share two quick stories from the book about why that's the case. This is the view from my old kitchen window. I wish I could still say my kitchen window because I feel like there's a little bit of distance now. But I lived in this apartment for about 13 years. I just moved out, and it was a beautiful neighborhood with about 6 or 7 languages being spoken just on that one block. And it's also a neighborhood that has a lot of challenges. I would constantly be hearing people screaming and arguing and yelling and car accidents and all sorts of just madness I saw in the 13 years that I lived there. And one time, about 9 years ago, I was taking a nap and I was woken up by a commotion outside of my window. And there was a couple who were arguing. And this was such a common occurrence in my neighborhood that I was just trying to ignore it and go back to sleep. But this argument kept getting louder and louder and louder. And I finally decided to get up out of my bed and look out the window. And there was a woman on the ground who was getting beaten. And she wasn't just getting beaten, she was screaming for help. So I jumped up out of my bed, I put on my clothes, I ran downstairs, I opened up the gate, I ran across the street because they were across the street at this point, and it was still going on. And so I ran across the street and I broke up this fight. And by the time I got down there, about 15 of my neighbors had heard the commotion and they had all come outside and they were just watching this woman get beaten, not doing anything to help. And I always argue that all of my neighbors who were just watching this woman get beat were practicing non-hyphen violence, right? In that they weren't being violent. They were explicitly being not violent. And sometimes I say that, depending on your understanding of what nonviolence is, you can make the argument that I was being more violent than my neighbors were because I used a limited amount of physical force to separate the two parties, and I might have hurt one of them in the process. And so you see how big of a difference it makes in our understanding of the word nonviolence when you put the hyphen in the word and you think nonviolence is just an adjective that describes the absence of something. It's a tricky word, right? Because nonviolence, it sounds like you're talking about not being violent, but nonviolence is a translation of the Sanskrit word ahimsa. And ahimsa means non-harm, right? Himsa means to harm or violence, and is the absence of. And so the literal translation is correct. But as many of us know, as we all know, like when you translate something from one language to another, there's so much that gets lost in the cultural nuance. In Sanskrit, the word ahimsa, even though it literally means non-harm, culturally, it was understood that it wasn't talking about the absence of something as much as the presence of something else. When you take away harm, what is there in its place? Nonviolence is not just the absence of harm, but the presence of something more. It's not about what you're not going to do in the face of violence. It's about when you see violence and injustice in your community, what are you going to do about it? Right? It's not about what not to do. It's about what you're going to do about violence and injustice. How are you going to put yourself in the middle of that situation and try to transform that situation in the way that Dr. King did and so many other advocates of nonviolence did, right? In our society today, there's so many ways in which violence and destruction and injustice is happening, and people just turn the other way and say that's none of my business. And that's not nonviolence the way we understand it, the way Dr. King understood it. It might be non-hyphen violent, but when you see unarmed Black people getting killed by the police and you turn away and say, that's none of my business, that's not nonviolence. Nonviolence is about trying to figure out what you're going to do to transform those systems. And this misunderstanding of nonviolence also leads to a very dangerous misunderstanding of the idea of peace. This is a woman named Autherine Lucy, one of the many unsung heroes of the movement. She was the first the first Black student to ever go to the University of Alabama in Tuscaloosa. And as you can imagine, the first day she was on campus, things got really tense. These are just some of the images of what happened the next day. A riot broke out. The KKK came and burnt a cross on campus. A mob surrounded the car she was traveling in and climbed up on top of it. And so in response to that violence, the school expelled Autherine Lucy. They said, the violence is happening because you're here. So in order for us to protect our school, you need to leave. So they expelled her. The next day, the local newspaper ran a headline that said, things are quiet in Tuscaloosa today. There is peace on the campus of the University of Alabama, right? There is peace because the riots had stopped. And in response to this sermon, or in response to this incident, Dr. King gave one of my all-time favorite sermons, which I highly recommend you all go take a look at. It's very easy to find online. The sermon is called When Peace Becomes Obnoxious. And in that sermon, Dr. King said that this wasn't a real peace. He called it a negative peace. Negative peace, he said, is the absence of tension that comes at the expense of justice. The absence of tension that comes at the expense of justice. Oftentimes, we think peace is about quiet and calm. But if someone is screaming in my face and I punch them and knock them unconscious, they're not screaming at me anymore. So it's quiet, it's calm, but did I just create peace, right? Negative peace comes at the expense of justice by sweeping issues under the rug. You know, I oftentimes also say that, like, after the bomb was dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, I guarantee you that things were really quiet and calm. And people do say sometimes that that was what we needed to do to create peace in our world, right? And it's because we have this gross misunderstanding of what we mean by peace and peacemaking. Dr. King said that negative peace is the type of peace that stinks in the nostrils of the Almighty God. And he said it is the type of peace that all people of goodwill should be doing everything to fight against. This misunderstanding of peace is what allows us to justify going to war to create peace, right? If we kill all the bad people, then we'll have peace. Mass incarceration, if we just lock up all the bad people, then we'll have peace. The militarization of the police, if all the protesters would just shut up, then we'll have peace. And also, for those of us who come from a Japanese cultural background, may be familiar with a different manifestation of the same idea of negative peace. I've found that Japan is a country and a culture that loves negative peace. We love things to be quiet and calm. There are many issues in my homeland in Japan that I wish people would talk more about. The treatment of Korean communities, Chinese communities, the Zainichi communities, lots of migrant communities, the untouchables, the treatment of women in Japan, environmental issues, alcoholism, suicide rates. But because we don't have the cultural language to really engage in difficult discussions, we just like to repress it and pretend everything is okay. And this also happens a lot in places of higher education and faith communities, in like professional environments, where we're taught not to talk about these things because it's uncomfortable and it's not professional, right? And that is exactly the same exact kind of negative piece that is so prevalent in our society. And so if that's negative piece, positive piece then can look really messy. And I think this is one of the key things that we need to remember, that peacemaking is a loud and messy process because we are calling for justice for all people and trying to move towards beloved community by dealing with root causes. And that's a really messy process. When we started to have conversations in my own family about early childhood traumas, it was a really messy process. It was not comfortable. But it is the type of mess and discomfort that is necessary to move towards real lasting peace. These images that we've all seen from the US civil rights movement, it may not look peaceful, but there's a way in which it might be more like, it might be closer to a real understanding of peace than the image that I showed earlier of that awkward family dinner, right? Because this is oftentimes what it takes to get to real peace, to have the difficult discussions that are necessary to get to positive peace. Water protectors disrupting the construction of various pipelines, the umbrella movement in Hong Kong. I just saw a documentary about them, so I'm really inspired by their work. And also even images like this, which is clearly not a nonviolent action. This is some of what happened after the murder of George Floyd. It's inevitable whenever something like this happens that you turn on the media and you see some talking head, some politician saying the protesters need to learn to be peaceful, right? That we agree with what they're doing, but they just need to do it peacefully. And as a nonviolence trainer, I don't think that rioting and setting fires and burning cars is the best and most strategic way to achieve lasting peace. And at the same time, when people say, oh, these protesters need to learn to be peaceful, something doesn't land well in me. And it's because Dr. King was also very articulate about this. He said that he called rioting the language of the unheard. And I think we need to understand that this is what happens when you don't give communities peace for 400 or 500 years. That it's the inevitable outcome of people who have had entire communities who have known nothing but violence for centuries, right? And so riots, as much as people may try to make the argument that riots are a form of violence, there's some way in which rioting is actually a cry for peace from a community who has never had it. And so we have to have that kind of longer perspective and understanding when we think about what peace means and what it looks like and what it takes to get to peace. And the last piece on this that I want to share is that Dr. King was arrested almost 30 times throughout his life. And half of those times he was charged by the United States government for disturbing the peace, right? And so nonviolent activism, if you don't understand the dynamics of what is happening, might look like you're disturbing the peace. It might look like you're creating conflict. But what we're actually doing is taking the conflict and the injustice that exists every day in some communities and not in others, and bringing it to the surface, bringing it to the light so that we can all see it and we can all talk about it together and we can learn to deal with it. So Dr. King was not disturbing peace. He was disturbing complacency. He was disturbing the normalization of violence. And that is so much of what nonviolence is about. It is about disturbing negative peace. And it's really important that we understand that. These are all things that make a lot of sense in theory, but what are some of the ways that it can actually look like in concrete ways? This is maybe a little bit theoretical too, but in our society today, like, one of the things that I've noticed in nonviolent spaces is that oftentimes in nonviolent spaces, we're not always skillful at honoring anger and honoring rage. like sometimes in nonviolent communities, we like to think that if someone is expressing rage, that they're doing it wrong, that they're not doing nonviolence right. But I think rage and anger is a natural response to injustice, and we need to figure out how to honor it and how to channel it in the right direction. But when we get aggressive in our society today, we oftentimes take our aggression out on individual people, right? And as human beings, we all also have the capacity to be compassionate and to be understanding. Conciliation is our ability to be understanding, is our ability to have empathy. It's our ability to understand the big picture. And we have this tendency to take our conciliatory attitudes towards broader conditions. And what I mean by that is we might take an issue like homelessness, and we might get angry at homeless people and say, what's wrong with you? Get a job. And then we take the broader conditions surrounding homelessness, and we like to say, oh, I feel so bad for homeless people, and I feel so bad for poor people, and I feel so bad for all the people who come from broken homes and all the children starving in Africa and all the poor people in Haiti. And that kind of compassionate attitudes towards broad conditions does nothing to challenge the condition, right? But this is the dynamic that we see in our society. We take our anger out on individual people, which oftentimes gets expressed as unprocessed rage, and we take our compassion out on conditions, which gets expressed as charity. It doesn't actually challenge conditions. In nonviolence, what we like to say is that we need to be angry, but we want to channel our righteous indignation towards broad conditions. And we want to be compassionate and to cultivate love and understanding, but to channel that love and understanding towards all of the people that are caught up in those conditions. And it's this X that marks our target in nonviolence. That's what we're aiming for, to cultivate righteous indignation and help people move it towards broad conditions, and to cultivate undying love and to channel it in the right direction towards all of the individuals that are caught up. In nonviolence, we are told that as the violence and the conflict escalate, we need to escalate our nonviolent response to that conflict. So if a conflict is happening in my own body or between two individuals, if it's a low level intensity of conflict, you might be able to tell someone everything's going to be fine, just take a deep breath, right? A perfectly legitimate response to low intensity levels of conflict. On a social scale, if there's a low level intensity conflict, you might fill out a petition. That might be the appropriate response. If I want to try to get a stop sign installed in my neighborhood, filling out a petition is a great response. But as the conflict begins to escalate, our response to that conflict also has to escalate with it. So if two people are fighting physically, you might have to get in between the two parties and pull them apart because the conflict has also escalated. A firefighter breaking down someone's door and entering someone's house without their permission feels like an escalated response, but it's the perfectly appropriate response if your house is burning down. UN peacekeeping forces or unarmed civilian peacekeeping forces might be a more appropriate response to high-level conflict at a social scale, or shutting down a highway, occupying government buildings. If the conflict you're responding to is that escalated, then that might be the appropriate response. Like the movement for Black Lives, they're not doing petition campaigns for a reason, because it is not the appropriate response to a 400, 500-year legacy of state violence, right? That is an extremely escalated form of harm. And so their response also has to be appropriately escalated. But one of the things that I've noticed in my time in organizing is that as we escalate our responses to conflict, we also tend to escalate polarization and division and separation and this us versus them, we're the good guys, they're the bad guys worldview. And I think it is that polarization and separation that is at the heart of what is destroying this planet. And so, how do we learn to escalate our tactics of nonviolent resistance while doubling down on the idea that we need to like target anger at conditions but love at individuals? How do we escalate our tactics while doubling down on a commitment to healing and reconciliation? This is an image that many of you on the call have probably seen or maybe even taken part in. It's an escalated response to an escalated form of harm. And it's very black and white, right? When I look at this image, as much as I've been on those front lines like that many times in my life, my muscles tend to tighten. And if we zoom in to this image and try to find an interpersonal conflict that is analogous to this image, it might look something like this, right? Two people just screaming at each other at odds. And I want to be clear that I'm not saying that this is like a wrong way to protest. I don't want to set up that good protester, bad protester dynamic. But for me, my North Star is healing. It's social healing. It's using nonviolent direct action as a modality of collective trauma healing. And if that's our goal, then if our muscles tighten, then that is not conducive to healing. Right? So I'm not saying these protesters are bad. What I am suggesting is that if our goal is healing, maybe there's a different way to do it that creates an energetic field that is more conducive to healing. This image, many of you may have seen, a woman named Aisha Evans was at a Black Lives Matter protest in Baton Rouge years ago. To me, it's a very similar image in some ways, but worlds apart in other ways. Because when I look at this image, my muscles actually tend to relax a little bit. There's something about the way Aisha Evans showed up in confrontation with the state that feels different to me. And if I look for an image that is analogous to this on an interpersonal conflict, it might look something like this. This is called a victim-offender dialogue. It is a dialogue between the man on the right, who's incarcerated in San Quentin, and the man on the left, Donald Lacey, whose daughter was murdered by the man on the right. And they're having this dialogue because they're ready to come together to try to move towards reconciliation. And, you know, there's a lot of differences between this image and that image. There's a lot of power dynamics that are different, right? And also the police may not be ready to have that conversation about reconciliation. But I have to wonder if there are some things that we can learn from the work that these people did to heal their own traumas and their own wounds so that they were ready to show up in response to the most escalated form of harm that either one of them have ever experienced, with a different energy and a different commitment to heal. And so that is some of the questions that I also have, and the explorations that I am interested in engaging with all of you and with all of our communities is, what is the healing work that we need to do in our own families, in our own communities, in our own movement spaces, so that when we show up to the front lines, we can show up with a different energy and a different commitment to healing, and to remember that we may be there tactically to occupy a government building, to shut down a highway, to cultivate righteous indignation and channel it towards these systems, but also remember to cultivate unwavering love and compassion and a commitment to interdependence and collective liberation for all of the people that are caught up in those conditions. And so we have a good amount of time for some dialogues. I was at a meditation retreat years ago with the Reverend Angel Kilda Williams, who some of you may know. And after her Dharma talk, she started the quote unquote Q&A portion of the evening by saying, all right, so who's got some answers? And so I want to invite us just into a discussion, not a Q&A where you have the questions and I have the answers, but just to be in dialogue about a lot of these questions that we all have. So yeah, I'll pause there and open it up.
All right. I am Barbara Yasui, and I'm going to be moderating the Q&A, or the A and Q, I guess, with Kazu. And Kelly and Bridget are going to be assisting me. So if you have a question or an answer for Kazu, please, you can either put it into the chat or you can do the little hand raise icon, and we will attempt to ask your question. Kazu can also see the questions in the chat. So give everyone a minute to think about it. Kazu, thank you so much for your words. So many different thoughts are running through my mind right now. But I wanted to start with a question that comes from Tsuru. And the question is, for those of us who are Asian American, how do we make sure that we're not reinforcing the model minority myth through our practice of nonviolence?
Yeah, thank you so much for that. Just a quick shout out to Eddie Zhang, who some of you may know, who is a formerly incarcerated activist who wrote an article years ago about, I forgot what it's called, but I'm sure if you Google Eddie Zhang and model minority, you might find it. It was something along the lines of how the model minority myth made my time in prison even more difficult or something like that. But yeah, nonviolence is about disruption, right? It's about disrupting that sort of complacency and the ways in which we normalize harm. And so if we understand nonviolence in the right context and are actually practicing that, then by definition, I think we're kind of rubbing up against that model minority myth that says we're all just here to study hard and make good money and stay under the radar, right? You know, a lot of nonviolence is about learning to be kind and compassionate and forgiving. But if that's all we're doing, then we're actually not challenging the systems that perpetuate harm at incredible, like way faster than we can kind of make change at one-on-one levels. And it's important to remember that one of my favorite Dr. King quotes is when he said, "Power without love is reckless and abusive, and love without power is sentimental and anemic." That for him, nonviolence wasn't just about love, and it wasn't just about kindness, that it was also about learning how we wield power in combination with love, right? So I think if we understand nonviolence not just as being kind, not just as being polite, not just as being forgiving, but also being fierce and also not being afraid to make demands on behalf of justice, then I think by definition we're going up against that model minority myth.
Thank you. A couple other questions have come up. One of them is, how do you learn to love a neo-Nazi who is trying to beat you down during a protest? How does one respond with compassion? How do you develop the ability to develop?
Yeah, thank you for that. One of my mentors, who is still living in San Francisco, I think he's in his late 70s or something. He's been arrested like 125 times or something like that throughout his life. He's pretty amazing. And when he was young, he was part of the sit-in the lunch counter sit-in movement. He's a white guy, and he was part of the sit-in movement. And he tells a story of one time he was in the lunch counters protesting the segregation of the lunch counters with his Black friends, and a member of the KKK came and held a knife in his throat. And he said, "N lover, you have 3 seconds to get up and leave this lunch counter, or I'm going to shove this knife into your throat." And David says that he looked the man right in the eye and says, "Brother, you do what you feel is right, and my job is to love you regardless. And he says that the man's eyes started welling up with tears and his hands started to shake, and he put the knife down and walked out of the lunch counter. One of the main reasons why he was able to do that is because he had prepared for that moment for years and years and years. Anyone who's read my book knows that I compare nonviolence to a martial art, and that no one's ever gone to a 4-hour karate seminar and then gotten into a fight in the streets or like participated in a karate tournament, right? Like being involved in a physical confrontation outside of the dojo or participating in the Olympics in karate is the equivalent of holding compassion for someone who is actively causing you harm. If you haven't been training for that moment, there is almost no chance that you're going to be able to do that. I say almost no chance because there are stories of people who have like, for whatever reason, have been able to do that. But that's why training is so important, right? That we're cultivating that sort of unwavering love for humankind before we go to the protest, before we engage with the person that has caused us harm, whether it's in a protest or in our day-to-day lives. So definitely the training, keeping in mind that, when I think about, I'm obviously there's no evidence of this. When I think about the heart and mind of a white supremacist or a Nazi or these people who are filled with hate, I can actually hold some compassion for the fact that they are so far removed from their own sense of humanity and their own sense of belonging to this network of mutuality that Dr. King talked about, that they're able to hold so much hatred in their heart. There's a beautiful quote that says, hating someone is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. Obviously, we are going to do everything in our power to stop the actions and the behaviors of these hateful people. And at the same time, to have some compassion that they are so broken inside that they're able to continue to go through life with so much hatred in their heart, and have some compassion for that part of who they are. Obviously, there's a lot more that I could say to this because this question is so central in nonviolence, but I'm sure it'll come through some of the other discussions as well.
Another question, this one from Suzanne Hidekawa, who says, you talked about Dr. King giving 2 reasons movements use direct action. First, to educate the public, and second, for negotiation. How would you expand on the concept of negotiation as it might pertain to tsuru and child detention?
Yeah, in nonviolence, because reconciliation is the long-term goal of any conflict, at some point, you're going to have to enter into discussions with people on the other side. Because if you're not willing to at some point enter into a dialogue, then by definition, you're going to have to try to create the changes that you seek to create by overpowering them and by dominating them. And to me, the idea that we can continue to use force and fear and domination and intimidation to just force our way over another human being or over a group of people is the reason why we've never had sustained peace as a society, as a species, right? And so I think negotiation is the commitment that at some point you need to be in dialogue with these people. I do believe that there is, a place in negotiation to like make demands of people when certain groups of people have historically had power for so long. I think there has to be space for certain communities to make demands and to say, no, we're not negotiating on our dignity. We are not negotiating away our human rights, right? But even within that, in terms of the changes that we seek to make in our society, at some point we have to be in dialogue and to make sure that people understand why the changes that we are making are necessary, or else there's always going to be conflict. So that may make, the East Point Peace Academy is working on developing a 250-year work plan. Like these are generational struggles. And I think if we think of these issues as like, how are we going to resolve everything in the next 5 years, then it feels impossible, because it probably is. But we have to remember that these are long-term struggles as well.
Which there's a sort of a short question about what are the best ways to engage in the training that you speak of?
Oh man, I don't think there's one answer to that. My partner, and actually Mike, who's on the call, Mike Ishii, and I have had this conversation too. My partner has been practicing something called RC, reevaluative counseling or co-counseling, for like 15 years. And she credits that modality probably more than anything else for how much she's been able to let go of a lot of her own childhood wounds. And it's how she's able to show up as loving of a person as she is today. So there's modalities like that. There's things like nonviolent communication. There are Kingian nonviolence trainings, even like actual martial arts. I find that the more comfortable I am at the possibility of physical confrontation, the less likely I am to be in a place of panic and use those physical forces. So martial arts can be helpful. Any sort of trauma healing modality. There's lots of organizations out there doing nonviolence training. So yeah, there's an endless amount of things you can do. And I hate to be that guy that's like, if you buy my book, you can find out this thing. But in the back of my book, I list a bunch of like different practices that people can engage in nonviolence. And if people reach out to me, I'm happy to send that to you as a PDF as well.
Right, thank you. Question from Ron Kobata, who says, how do you, on the spot, determine what an appropriate response is? Isn't our conditioning Darwinian response one of fight or flight?
Yeah.
In the moment, how do you decide?
So again, part of it is about the training, right? Like the options that are available to us, the choices that are available to us in the moment grow exponentially the more we're prepared for the moment. There's, many of you may know the beautiful quote from Viktor Frankl, who says, between stimulus and response, there's a space, and in that space lies our freedom to choose. And part of something like mindfulness training is about expanding that space between stimulus and response. So the police fire a tear gas canister, that's the stimulus. Now, how am I going to respond to that? With things like mindfulness training, it becomes less reactionary, and there's more space for me to notice, oh, this thing is happening. Here are all the tools that are available for me. Now, how am I going to choose to respond in that moment? And I'm sorry, I feel like there was a second part to that question that I wanted to respond to.
Let's see. It's about
the fight or flight.
Yeah.
So I'm working on another book right now that really is trying to bring together a lot of trauma healing and brain science to nonviolent resistance movements. And the fight or flight mechanism is kind of the oldest part of our brain. The reptilian part of our brain is the part of our brain that is responsible for the fight or flight mechanism. And when that part of our brain kicks in, some people, as a psychologist, call it the amygdala hijacking, because the amygdala hijacks the rest of our brain, and the part of our brain, the prefrontal cortex, that is responsible for being able to think about logic and consequence, that is responsible for thinking about creativity and visioning and empathy, the part of our brain that is responsible for nonviolence is literally disengaged on a physiological level. And the more we train our bodies, the more we are able to heal through our traumas, the more we practice emotional regulation tools, the more like control we have over our amygdala, and the less reactive that amygdala is. So we're less likely to enter into that fight or flight. So when the tear gas canister gets fired on us and we enter into our fight or flight, like it's over. Like all of the things that we've been practicing, they're not available to us anymore. But there are things that we can do leading up to that moment that make it less likely for our amygdala to hijack the rest of our brain. And so that's a lot of the training that we need to be doing beforehand, right? Is the emotional regulation, the trauma healing work, and just knowing what options are available to us if and when those things happen.
Thank you. Question from another person. How do you answer a local resident who lives in the city where there's a detention center and who says, get the F out of here, go back to California, you don't live here, I have to feed my family and pay my mortgage with the job I have at this point?
Yeah.
Sorry.
No, you're fine. So there's two things there. One is the go back to California thing. I highly recommend, if you haven't already, many of us read this in school, but I think with more of a consciousness, to reread Letter from a Birmingham Jail, because Martin Luther King's Letter from a Birmingham Jail was a response to a group of 8 Alabama clergymen who accused Dr. King of inciting violence and being an outsider and not being from Birmingham and all these things. And he does a beautiful job responding to that, partly by saying that I'm here because injustice is here. And the whole, we are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. What affects one person directly affects all people indirectly. And so nobody within the bounds of the United States should be considered an outsider anywhere. And I think if you asked him, 5 years after that, he would have said the same thing, except he would have said nobody on earth should be considered an outsider anywhere on earth. And so I think the whole outside agitator thing is, it's a little outdated. Like, we are impacted by things that happen in Arizona. And I mean, if the pandemic taught us anything, we are deeply impacted by things that happen halfway across the world, right? And so the response also has to cross borders in the same way. And the thing about, I have to feed my family, that's legit, right? Those are legitimate concerns. And I think we as movements need to do a better job of acknowledging those concerns. I think there's ways in which the left has gotten better since the Vietnam War. Obviously, I wasn't around for that, but from what I understand, of not demonizing soldiers and realizing that soldiers are also getting screwed over by the military industrial complex, and they are not the enemy. And we sometimes struggle to make that transition with policing and with detention officers and things like that. In the climate justice movement, there's been a lot of attempts made at ensuring that people who work in coal mines and oil plants and stuff like that have access to training that'll provide new employment for them. And I think if we as a movement can't get creative enough to begin to envision what might be on the other side of abolition for the people whose livelihood depends on these systems, it's going to be an uphill battle, because then for them, it's always going to be these people are coming after my job, right? But I think, a lot of people I do a lot of work in prison. Prison guards have some of the highest suicide rates, alcoholism rates, domestic violence rates, because these systems suck for everybody. Nobody is free from the violence of these incredibly violent institutions. And I've even done trauma healing circles with police officers and prison guards. And once you create a safe enough container, it almost takes no time for them to dive into the grief of how much they're suffering from these systems. And so I think we need to remember that not everybody is pure evil. And there's an opportunity to engage in discussion with these people about how much these systems are impacting them as well. There's an opening there.
So this leads to another question. Do you believe that there can be reconciliation with police officers who are armed agents of the state, whether they're on or off duty, or that police can be in restorative justice circles with non-police? Why or why not?
Yeah, I was hoping you'd ask that question because the person who asked it, so your name is Bettina, and I used to have these epic, like 5 hour long and the 3 in the morning discussions about this kind of stuff. So I know you're not that, Bettina, but yeah, I do, because I've seen it happen. It's hard. There's a lot of like things that can happen and can't happen. Like, obviously, I wouldn't bring police officers into RJ circles with people who have been harmed by policing right away. A lot of the restorative justice dialogues, like the victim offender dialogues that I do, it's like 2 years of working with both parties separately before we bring them together for a dialogue. And I think oftentimes in RJ spaces, we rush too quickly into bringing two people together or two sides together. And I think that can be dangerous. But, again, like understanding that the system of policing is hurting police officers because the system is dysfunctional and it is inhumane. And they know that better than anybody. They might not be able to articulate it as such, but they all have friends who have committed suicide because the job was too tough. All of them do, right? And we need to keep in mind, like in the state of California, to become a police officer requires 664 hours of training, right? 664 hours of training. In the state of California, to become a cosmetologist, it takes 1,600 hours of training. So it's almost 3 times as much training to become a cosmetologist as to become a police officer. And then we send these people into the streets to deal with mental health crisis, to deal with armed people. Like, it's not like the system is broken and it's not working for anybody. And I think part of like restorative justice at its best is it begins to actually blur the line between who's the perpetrator and who's the survivor of crime. And we get to a place where we can just acknowledge harm is present. It's not as simple as saying you caused the harm and you experience the harm. I know we want things to be black and white, but once we complexify and we understand the full story behind these incidents of harm, it's rarely that black and white. And the reality is that we are all being harmed here. And can we create enough nuance to hold all of that?
Okay, another question, sort of related to an earlier one from Shoshana Arai. How can we apply the principles of restorative justice and healing to ICE detention centers? How can we achieve Ubuntu with Homeland Security? Maybe if you can explain Ubuntu, I think maybe some people don't understand that.
Yeah, Ubuntu is a term that comes, I believe, from some people in South Africa, but it essentially means it's the teaching that is so universal across so many cultures that's around like, I am because you are. It's about interdependence, interbeing, as Thich Nhat Hanh would say. I want to be clear to like that we don't forget the fierceness of nonviolence, and that you can't reconcile with someone who is actively abusing you, right? The abuse has to stop first. And so I think, as I wrote about in my book too, Dr. King was very clear when he was assassinated. He was organizing a mass campaign of civil disobedience in Washington, D.C. for the Poor People's Campaign. And he said that we need to build a nonviolent movement, that is as disruptive and dislocative as a riot. That he believed that nonviolent movements can have that level of disruption and can be powerful enough to stop these systems of injustice from moving forward. And so I think, when we look at, every time we talk about ICE detention centers, I think like with many of us, like I remember this one particular image that I saw of a young boy who must have been like 4 years old in a cage crying. Like this country should be ashamed of that, right? And we need to do everything we can to stop that from happening yesterday. And I think there is a way to go about doing that work that leaves us the best possibility for reconciliation on the other end. I think we can stop detention centers and stop these buses from moving folks from the centers to centers without demonizing people. And it's, again, like a lot of that requires work that we do on the front end, because I know when I'm at a demonstration facing a row riot police, especially because they look like robots, the way that they're dressed, and they may be getting ready to like pepper spray me, it's really easy for me to dehumanize them. It's a lot easier for me to think about humanizing them now in the safety of my own home. And so it's really important that we do that work ahead of time so that we can take these values that we hold dear and not lose sight of them in the height of a conflict. But yeah, I mean, I think we also need to remember that nonviolence can be powerful and can shut down systems.
A question about what are some conversational tactics that you can use when speaking to someone who approaches a topic defensively? For example, talking about homelessness or detention centers to someone who seemingly does not want to actively listen or change their mind.
My experience is that a lot of people who don't want to listen have some frozen need to be heard. And I love a good debate, and as I talk about a lot too, like when I'm in a conflict, I know I'm right. And I want to prove that I'm right. And so it's really hard for me not to end up in a back and forth debate. But like you said, some people are just never going to change their mind by you trying to convince them. What I have found is that if you can keep asking questions with genuine curiosity to try to understand where they're coming from and to help that person feel heard, then there's a lot more openness and possibilities for transformation. And so oftentimes, like reflecting back what I'm hearing from them, and like active listening is an active process, right? Like I'm actively trying to figure out, is this what this person is saying? What do they mean when they use this word? What do they mean when they talk about this thing? And so like engaging with general curiosity, I've continued to be blown away at the power of just helping someone feel heard.
So related to your comments about talking with someone with another viewpoint, a question about how do you deal with the harm of devil's advocate in these kinds of debates where someone is playing the devil's advocate?
Yeah, that's me oftentimes. I mean, again, I think it's about asking the right questions, right? And trying to get because like sometimes when someone's playing the devil's advocate, it's not like they don't even believe the thing that they're asking, right? One thing that's been really helpful in my study and practice of nonviolent communication is they say that to have some discernment between people's needs and their strategies, that we all have universal human needs that we're constantly trying to get met. One of the basic principles of nonviolent communication is that everything we do and everything we say is an attempt to meet a need. And those needs are universal. We all have them. We all share them. And sometimes we choose poor strategies to try to get those needs met. So if I have a need to be heard, I might scream at somebody. My need isn't to scream at somebody. My need is to be heard. I chose the strategy of screaming at somebody to try to get heard, which is oftentimes not effective, right? Because then people get defensive and shut down. And so when people ask devil's advocate questions, I wonder what it is that they're actually trying to, like, what is the need that they're trying to get met? Is it to prove that their devil's advocate question is right or that I'm wrong? Or is there some deeper desire for connection or for their voice to matter or to be validated? And if we can hone in on what that need is and try to help them meet that, then perhaps the devil's advocates will stop coming.
Okay, I think we have room, maybe time for a couple more questions. So a question from Mike Ishii. Can you speak about the methodology of civil disobedience, what it requires to engage in that way and how it can be used strategically? And can you also, so that's part one. Second part is, can you also speak about creating a practice or shugyo?
Mm. Civil disobedience is kind of like it's a small subset of direct action, right? Civil disobedience is about explicitly breaking laws, of taking actions that are not legal. And I think it's really important that movements are not afraid to do those things. Obviously, lots of complications come with that, of like who's able to get arrested and how do we support those people, and all sorts of things. But in the letter from a Birmingham jail, Dr. King speaks really powerfully to this idea of just laws and unjust laws, and that we have an obligation to follow just laws. And similarly, we have an obligation to disobey unjust laws. And I would argue that at this point in our history as a species, like the whole entire system that we live under is unjust. And so we have an ethical obligation to disobey injustice. And so that could look like so many things. We oftentimes see protesters taking over highways. I'm not the biggest fan of that tactic specifically, because oftentimes those highways aren't directly associated with the issue that they're protesting. And I think strategically, we can get a lot more out of it when we are able to make direct ties between the thing that we are shutting down and the issue that we are confronting. There's a really great tool that a lot of activists use called points of intervention, which is really helpful in helping us figure out what might be a strategic place where we bring our civil disobedience. So if you're planning any sort of direct action or civil disobedience, I highly encourage you all to check out that tool. And yeah, shugyo. So some of you may know the word shugyo, which is probably most commonly translated as practice. But as I wrote about in my book, I'm learning Chinese right now, so I practice Chinese every day. That's not shugyo, right? If I go to the basketball court and shoot some free throws, that's not shugyo. Shugyo is not just about practicing like an intellectual or physical thing. It's about constant repetition of something to develop your spiritual, moral, ethical character. So a lot of like in Japanese, if you have a martial arts practice, that's considered to be shugyo, because martial arts is not about learning how to beat someone up, right? It's actually about developing your character. Spiritual practice, meditation is called a shugyo. And so there's obviously different forms of shugyo that's going to connect with you that might not connect with other people. And so I think it's really important for all of us to have constant, ideally daily practices that we are doing to develop our character. There's a quote that I love that says, "We don't rise to the level of our expectation, we fall to the level of our training," by an ancient Greek poet. We have these wonderful expectations about the kind of people we want to become. But because most of us haven't had the training to become those people, we've been trained by the dominant empire around patriarchy and white supremacy and capitalism and violence and domination and all these things, we don't know what it's actually like to live into those values. And so it's the constant practice, the shugyo, that changes, that rewires our conditioning, our training, so that we can be a little bit closer to our expectations.
Yeah, couple questions related to the situation in the Ukraine. What options do the people of Ukraine have for responding to the abhorrent situation that they're experiencing? How do you see reconciliation healing with the maniac? And then related to that, could helping Putin be genuinely heard possibly have helped avert some of the current tragedy mess that's happening?
Yeah, two big questions. I'm actually a believer, as Dr. King was, in that there is such a thing as the lesser of two evils. Um, I think there are times when violence as a form of self-defense might be the lesser of two evils. And a couple of things on that, because oftentimes I'll say something like that, and then like that's the thing that people say that Kazu said, or like, quotes get taken out of context. There's a larger context here. One is that anytime we use violence as a form of self-defense, we have to double down on our efforts at reconciliation on the other end. Because if not, we may have prevented temporarily this greater violence from occurring, but the people that we just use self-defense on, they probably hate you even more, and it's only a matter of time before there's some new conflict that arises with them, right? So violence can never be the final thing that we do. Also, once again, the more we're training in nonviolence, the more options are available to us. If you have no training in nonviolence and someone is like assaulting you, then yeah, violence is probably the most effective method at keeping you alive. But if you've been training in Aikido, or if you've been training in like radical forms of nonviolence and nonviolent communication, there may be more options available to you in that moment, right? And so, in the Ukraine, obviously, as a nation, they haven't been investing in nonviolence training. I know that historically they've had really powerful nonviolent movements not that long ago, but in the face of such brutality, it's really, really difficult to do, right? And so I mourn that gap. There are organizations that do unarmed civilian peacekeeping, where they send unarmed, non-violently trained people into war zones to try to act as human buffers. And I wonder, as I think I read Biden is trying to get $33 billion from the Senate today to send more aid to Ukraine. Like, what if we spent $33 billion on a non-violent response in the Ukraine? I think this is one of the things that's unfair oftentimes when war breaks out, is like, well, what can non-violence do about it with no money versus what can violence do about it with $1 trillion, right? So like part of it is just like we have to reframe how we're having these debates of like, violence has an incredible amount of resources. If nonviolent movements had 1/10 of that, what could we accomplish? And then the question about Putin, I think yes and no. When I think about somebody like Putin or our former president, what I see is someone who is so deeply traumatized and is acting out of a place of trauma and has these frozen needs to be seen, to feel powerful, that they will probably never get met, right? And I believe that any individual is capable of healing. Some people have experienced so much harm, or has experienced so much harm and has been just kind of like fed in one direction for so long, that to bring about healing for that person would take so much effort, like a complete wraparound approach, 24 hours a day, all of their community members and the people that they love being involved. I think it's possible, but it would take that much work. With someone like a Putin, it's possible if all of those resources can be put in place. Is it possible to put all those resources in place? I don't know. But I do believe that anybody is capable of healing. Like the work that I do in the prisons, every day I get to spend time with people who have committed multiple murders and showed no remorse until 30 years later when they had these spaces to be seen. So I do think it's possible. I don't think it's necessary for us to stop Putin from doing what he's doing. Again, I think the first step is to remove people like him from power. And then if it's possible for them to receive healing, I would love to see that happen.
We are about out of time, and I do not want to end on Putin. So I'm going to end with a wonderful question from Celeste. It says, how do we fuel ourselves for the long-term practice of nonviolence? How do we also center pleasure and joy in the movement?
Yeah, so I was facilitating this 2-year-long program in San Quentin years ago, and it was a trauma healing program. So every week we'd gather for 2 hours and talk about our childhood traumas and all the things that we've experienced, all the things that we've, the ways that we harmed other people. And one of the participants came in about a year into the program, and he said, "Can we talk about something happy today?" You know, and it was a really important reminder that the reason why we do this is to get to a place where we remember how beautiful life is and how beautiful it is to remember that we belong to each other and that we belong to this planet. And in nonviolence, we're always very clear that the way that we go about creating the change that we want to see in the world is going to be reflected in the change that we make. And so a lot of what we're talking about these days at East Point is when we go into spaces of direct action, we see lots of polarization, we see yelling, we see screaming, we see destruction, we see visions of wanting to tear down a system. How do we design direct actions that remind people of how beautiful life is and how good it feels to remember that we are dependent on each other and that our liberation is tied to all of our liberations? How do we bring in beauty and mystery and song and art and prayer into the ways that we go about creating change? Because that's going to be reflected in the change that we create, right? And so without access to those emotions, engaging in so-called nonviolent movements can feel violent because all we're talking about is trauma and destruction and tearing things down. And so, yeah, let's remember that this work is incredibly beautiful.
Thank you for those last words. Are there is there anything else that you want to leave us with before I turn it back over to Mika?
Sure. I was talking about belonging just now, and I've been talking a lot about how, psychologists will say that the fear of not belonging, the fear of being alone and isolated, is perhaps the most common root of trauma for all humans across cultures, across ages. And I've started to think that it is actually, as much as it's the most common root cause of trauma, it's also the biggest delusion that we live with as human beings. Because I believe that belonging is a fundamental universal law of reality. That it is the way, it is how our universe is structured, is that we are interdependent. And so we can't help but belong to each other. And I think the work that we are trying to do as advocates of social change is to remind all of us of this universal truth, right? That we truly belong, that we can't help but belong to each other. And so, yeah, I'm just grateful for this opportunity to remind myself of that a little bit more through these discussions and by being with you all today.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to turn it over to Mika now for the closing.
Yes, thank you so much, Kazu, for your talk and for your extensive answers. Thank you to everyone who sent in questions and answers in the chat. Really sorry for questions that we weren't able to get to today, but hopefully we can continue these conversations through a variety of different meeting places in the future. And as we wrap up, I just wanted to quickly offer some of those dates for you. You'll also receive this information in a follow-up email from us. So if you don't have an easy way to write this information down, don't worry, we will send it out. But The first things that I wanted to mention is that this event is part 1 of a 2-part series. In 2 weeks, on May 12th at 5:30 Pacific, 8:30 Eastern, which is also a Thursday, we'll be hosting a book club to continue discussing these ideas and the rest of healing resistance. And hopefully we'll be able to also maybe get to some of the questions and wrestle with them together that we weren't able to answer or discuss tonight. And then further into the future, Kazu has also agreed to put together some trainings for Tsuru for Solidarity, and these will be coming up on July 16th and 17th this summer. Details are to follow, but if you're interested in those trainings, make sure you have those dates in mind. When we send out information, we'll also send you the links for ordering Kazu Haga's book from the Red Balloon bookstore, or if you would like kind of assistance with ordering that text, Tsuru can also provide copies, and we'll provide the link for that as well. And Bridget's been really wonderful about sharing those in the chat. So thank you so much, everyone, for being here and listening and speaking with us. And I hope you have an excellent rest of your evening. Again, thank you.
Thank you all so much. Good to be with you all.